As World War II progressed, it would be fair to say that Hitler and his unsuspecting army were extremely unprepared for the speed with which the Allied forces advanced into France after the memorable landings that took place on the coast of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. Many people mark this point as being the beginning of the end of World War II and the successful completion of Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day, turned the tide for both sides, pushing Adolf Hitler and his Nazi army of occupation into a defensive position, while the Allies quite literally went on the attack. Despite the most appalling weather conditions, this was the largest ever invasion to take place in a single day, as more than 130,000 Allied soldiers landed on the Normandy beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword. The remarkable success of the invasion owed a great deal to the meticulous preparation and utter secrecy that characterized every detail of the operation. After years of planning, the British, American and Canadian troops charged with the liberation of France managed to completely surprise the Germans, not just those in defensive positions along the Normandy coastline, but also Hitler and his officials back in Berlin. They'd been convinced that the expected Allied invasion, when it came, would be from Dover to Calais, and that it couldn't possibly happen in such terrible storms, which meant that even the German commander Erwin Rommel, who was in charge of preparing for the anticipated attack, went home to celebrate his wife's birthday. The role of British intelligence had been crucial, not least because they'd worked so closely with the French resistance to prepare the way. For the people of France, the years of Nazi occupation had robbed them of so much, and the bravery of the resistance was a testament to the fact that their spirit had never been broken. As the 1st Airborne Division had arrived to secure Pegasus Bridge just a matter of hours before the D-Day landings, the delighted French, who were the first to be liberated, were so pleased to see the Allies that they gave them a hero's welcome, and at the local cafe, the champagne that had been buried in the garden for safekeeping throughout the German occupation was dug up so they could celebrate in style. So, with France ready and waiting, the Normandy landings more successful than anyone had ever dared to hope, it was time for the Allies to push for victory in Europe, and it was time for Operation Cobra to be put into action. Pushing from the beachheads, the American General Omar Bradley was in command of Operation Cobra, alongside fellow US General George Patton, and from Britain, General Bernard Montgomery. As July 1944 drew to a close, Cobra succeeded in breaking through the German lines, opening up a dash across France, which progressed into the autumn, hindered not by German defences, but ironically by a lack of fuel. Nevertheless, when Bradley announced that Cobra had struck a more deadly blow than anyone had dared imagine, he was evidently delighted with what had been achieved. However, it wasn't all quite such good news, particularly as the Allies failed to move at the speed that had been hoped for. Between the 12th and 21st of August 1944, they struggled to close the Falaise Pocket, an area between the French towns of Troon, Argenton, Vimoutiers and Chambois. Effectively, they should have been able to trap and capture large numbers of German soldiers, but it took so long to close the pocket that more than 100,000 Nazi troops escaped to fight another day. Moving on, the newly promoted Field Marshal Montgomery, fondly known to his men as Monty, and his British 21st Army Group were creating a line of advance heading for the northern border of Belgium, preparing to march into Germany. The US 12th and 6th Army Group were also setting up a push towards German territory in the south of France. With the troops in place, it was time for action, and the method of advance was fiercely debated. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who'd been Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe for Operation Overlord, now added the command of ground forces in Europe to his duties, and favoured a very broad movement, capturing the vital channel ports and Antwerp. The commanding role, post-D-Day, was one Montgomery had hoped to secure for himself, but with such a predominance of American troops in action in France, it was felt that a US commander would be more successful than a British one. Montgomery was also notorious for being rather awkward to give orders to, and there was undoubtedly antagonism between him and the American generals Bradley and Patton. Not surprisingly, Montgomery had a different point of view to Eisenhower, believing that short, sharp, concentrated thrusts across the River Rhine, keeping the different sections of the Allied forces separate, would be a more efficient and effective way to proceed. Due to the fact that the Allies only had one deep water port in use, the demand for fuel was always behind what was available, and as a result, Eisenhower's plan, which needed a large combat supply, simply wasn't feasible. One of the main natural barriers into Germany was the River Rhine on the Dutch-Belgian border. To make way for an Allied crossing, Operation Market Garden was decided upon, with the tactical objectives of securing the bridges over the rivers of the Netherlands to facilitate a rapid advance into Germany. This operation relied heavily upon the use of both large-scale airborne assaults and a blanket cover of ground forces. Market, of the codenamed Market Garden, stood for all the airborne activity involved, and Garden referred to the army as the active land troops. Previous operations as large as this took months to plan and practice, but the preparations for Market Garden were completed in just a week, with no opportunity for rehearsal and almost no tactical training. However, Montgomery was convinced that it would be successful, and even when photographic reconnaissance picked up German tanks as little as 9 miles away from the paratroopers' drop zones, he chose to dismiss them as not being in service. Even so, considering there had been so little preparation, Market Garden got off to a great start, with most of the airborne forces landing on target or very close, and the ground troops of the Garden part of the operation capturing 4 out of 5 of their intended bridges. However, Allied fortunes soon began to change, as much-needed supplies, including fuel, dried up, and having an enforced wait before proceeding allowed time for the German resistance to grow. The losses of Market Garden became so great and the German response so strong that the operation had to be withdrawn. And with up to 20,000 Allied casualties, it was far from being the success that Monty had been so sure of. After the failure of Market Garden, the Allies were not in a strong position, and the need for a working port was becoming even more obvious. This prompted heavy fighting in Belgium, as the 1st Canadian Army triumphed between October the 2nd and November the 8th, 1944. The 5 weeks of battling with a very strong German defence did eventually secure a victory that opened up the vital port of Antwerp for Allied shipping. The opening of Antwerp, combined with the successful capture of the large port of Marseille in the south of France, went a long way towards ending the crippling supply shortage that was hampering the Allies' progress towards Germany. More important still, the Germans were coming under substantial attack on all sides. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets were pushing the Germans back towards their homeland, and the battles were bitter and hard fought, with the Russians inflicting terrible casualties on the retreating Nazis. The brutal treatment of Russia by Hitler's invading armies earlier in the war was now being revisited on the perpetrators, and the Germans were on the run. With the thousands lost during and after the Normandy landings on the Western Front, and the Russians being responsible for inflicting so many casualties in the east, the German army was being worn down and weakened. And even the launch of Hitler's powerful new weapon, the V1 in July 1944, attacking London and other cities, could do nothing to deter his enemy's resolve. But like a wounded animal, as he saw his empire crumble around him, Hitler hit out at the Allies in any way he could, and the V1 was superseded by the more advanced V2 rocket. This was the single most expensive project of Hitler's Third Reich. It was embarked upon because one of the disadvantages of the V1 had been the loud buzzing sound it made, heralding its arrival, which earned it the nickname of the Doodlebug. But when the V2 travelled through the air at the speed of sound, not a sound was actually made to warn the enemy that it was on its way. Nevertheless, the V2 was far from being anything more than a useful tool in Hitler's armoury. Yet the Führer believed that he could still successfully defend Germany, if only he could neutralise the Allied forces on the Western Front. He also, quite rightly, felt that Russia was too strong by this time to overcome, so his full attention was turned towards the Allies in the West. Hitler was convinced if he could clear the Allies from the West, he would have the bargaining power to persuade the Americans and the British to end their uneasy alliance with the Soviet Union and settle a negotiated peace with the Axis powers. Meanwhile, if all could be made quiet on the Western Front, this would buy Hitler sufficient breathing space to create new weapons, like the V2 rocket, that could put him in a better position to fight back. It was Hitler's turn to seize the moment as the Germans launched a blistering offensive in the Ardennes that has gone down in history as the Battle of the Bulge. At a time when the Allies had victory in their sights, Hitler proved that the Germans were still capable of taking the initiative. The planning for the attack was conducted in the greatest detail, and secrecy was the absolute key. In order to stop the Allies intercepting information, ground troops and vehicles were only moved at night, and radio transmissions were kept to an absolute minimum. Even though British intelligence predicted the possibility of a German offensive operation, the Allies were so preoccupied with their own agenda as the endgame approached, little attention was paid to the actions of an army that was in effect already beaten. The Battle of the Bulge began on the 16th of December 1944 in the Ardennes, and the German aims were very clearly defined. Firstly, they were to clear as much of the area as possible, and then advance northwards to take back the critical port of Antwerp, which was so important to the Allies. Once these objectives had been achieved, the second part of the plan would then use a strategic movement to encircle the Allied troops, just as had been so successful all those years earlier in 1940 on the beaches of Dunkirk. Back then, it had been a similar offence through the Ardennes that had done such huge damage to the Allies, and Hitler was ready to repeat the tried and tested formula in one last-ditch attempt to keep Germany's hopes alive. The initial barrage assault on the Allies began at 5:30 a.m. on the 16th of December, and by 8 a.m. 3 of the 4 German armies involved were in battle. The lengths that the Germans had gone to in order to keep the operation under wraps certainly paid off, as the Allies were totally unprepared for an attack in the region of the Ardennes. They had wrongly assumed that any German activity at this late stage would be defensive, believing that even Hitler would not plan an offensive operation at this point in the war, especially in such a weakened position. Nevertheless, as soon as Eisenhower and his fellow commanders comprehended that this was more than just a counterattack, they quickly realized their error of judgment. Unfortunately, it took no more than a week to reinforce the area with over 250,000 troops. It was, of course, the middle of winter, and the weather was seasonably cold, with ice and snow proving to be a real problem. Vehicles had to be constantly run so that oil didn't freeze. But with the ever-problematic fuel shortages, this was a far from satisfactory solution to the problem. And it wasn't only vehicles and weapons that were freezing up. The conditions for the troops were equally horrific and soon became a cause for concern. The superiority of the Allied Air Force was so great that it was actually fortunate for the Germans that the planes were prevented from flying due to the bad weather conditions. However, the weather did begin to improve on the 23rd of December. And the Air Force not only managed to bomb German troops and their fast disintegrating supplies, but also proved a lifeline, dropping food, blankets and medicine to their own men. Yet even after sustaining such losses, the German army continued to fight back and took many prisoners of war. Several massacres took place, and in one instance, the Germans, after eating their captives' food and smoking their cigarettes, lined up approximately 150 American soldiers in a field and shot them. Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley and Montgomery often met to plan the most effective way to end the Battle of the Bulge. At one such conference, Eisenhower pointed out that the present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. This was because he realized that the Germans were much easier to defeat when they were open in offense rather than protected in defense. The relationship between Montgomery and his fellow American commanders had always been subject to elements of resentment, dating all the way back to the North African campaigns of 1942. And of course, the fact that the American generals he had in the past antagonised, most notably Omar Bradley and George S. Patton, were key figures in the Battle of the Bulge, made matters even more difficult. As the Battle of the Bulge continued into the new year of 1945, Eisenhower ordered Montgomery to go on the offensive. On the 1st of January, he was instructed to mobilise and meet up with Patton's men, who'd been advancing from the south since the 19th of December 1944, and in so doing, trap Hitler's troops. But Montgomery refused to put his men into a situation for which he claimed they were unprepared, and didn't begin his attack until the 3rd of January, by which time many German soldiers had been able to escape. Needless to say, the Americans were far from pleased at Montgomery's disregard for orders, especially as Patton's army had suffered heavy casualties to fulfill their part of the operation. For the Allies, the majority of whom were American troops, the Battle of the Bulge was one of the bloodiest of the entire war. The US body count was some 19,000 men, and although ultimately an Allied victory as the Germans retreated, it had been a costly engagement so close to the end of the war. Hitler withdrew his troops from the Ardennes on January the 7th, and although the Battle of the Bulge didn't officially end until the 25th of the month, on the very day that the Germans started their retreat, Montgomery was responsible for causing a huge row within the Allied camp. In a press conference after the battle, Montgomery was quick to take the credit for the success of the operation, quoting it as being one of the most tricky he'd ever handled, with no reference to the major part played by the American generals, while conveniently brushing over his own failure to follow orders. Both Patton and Bradley were understandably furious. Montgomery, who still believed he should be made commander of the ground forces in Europe, seemed oblivious to the resentment he'd caused. So Eisenhower had a very difficult situation to handle. With the push for Berlin now imminent, he needed his commanders working together. But Bradley and Patton threatened to resign if something wasn't done about Monty. Eisenhower showed his true leadership qualities by somehow persuading Montgomery to apologise, and a working relationship was restored, even if it was never destined to be particularly harmonious. This Allied victory was very bad news for Adolf Hitler, as not only did the battle take out nearly all of Germany's reserve troops, but also the Führer found himself backed into a corner, pushed into a completely defensive situation. But it wasn't just the Germans who needed to consolidate their position. Having been hit hard by the battle, the Allies were badly in need of the chance to restore some order and replenish supplies. Amazingly, this was all done in only a matter of weeks, and it wasn't long before the race for Berlin was fully mobilised. Eisenhower planned his route along the River Rhine, which would lead to taking control of the Ruhr. The Rhine at this time was heavily defended along the western side, and in order to get across, the Allies would have to clear the area, and they began their campaign to achieve this goal in February 1945. But the Western Allies were not the only ones with their sights set on Berlin. Although fighting on the same side, Stalin and the Russians already had their own agenda, with a view to establishing communist nations in the post-war era. By mid-January, the Red Army was advancing at an alarming pace, and by February they were just 50 miles off their target. Fearful that Stalin would exploit the political advantage of reaching Berlin first, Churchill in particular believed that the matter needed careful consideration. Because the Western Allies were experiencing less resistance than the Russians were, there was a very good chance that they could get there first, and Churchill advocated pushing for Berlin before the Soviets got there. Eisenhower, on the other hand, was of the opinion that because Berlin was Hitler's city, the fight would be protracted and brutal, and he didn't want to risk the lives of perhaps thousands of Allied soldiers unnecessarily. With an eye on the bigger picture, Eisenhower also believed it was important to keep Stalin on side, and he knew that offering the Russian the grand prize of Berlin would help to ensure Soviet cooperation. Much to the vexation of Churchill, supported by Field Marshal Montgomery, Eisenhower trusted his own instincts and gave the Soviets the honour of taking Berlin, while the Western Allies concentrated on the northern areas of Germany. With the end of the war in sight, it was time for the Allies to begin discussions about the endgame and what was to happen afterwards. The Malta Conference began on the 30th of January 1945 between the Americans and the British. The plan had been to discuss the final campaign against Hitler without the Soviets, but as President Roosevelt wasn't able to attend until the 2nd of February, the last day of the talks, little progress was made. The issue of how to help the victims of the Holocaust who'd been displaced around Europe was raised, but this was put on the agenda for the next scheduled meeting of the Allies at the Yalta Conference, to which the Soviets were invited. This conference had originally been planned to take place on the Mediterranean, but Stalin had been advised by his doctors against travelling long distances, so instead the venue was transferred to Yalta in the Crimea. The meeting of the Big Three, as Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin were known, took place from the 4th to the 11th of February and would prove to be one of the most significant conferences of the Second World War. Ironically, while diplomacy ran its course, the Red Army were very close to Berlin, so Stalin felt himself to be in a very strong position when it came to dictating terms. Poland was a huge issue for the Russians, and Stalin demanded that Poland be made a strong and powerful buffer, as it was the corridor between the Soviet Union and Germany. The Russian leader gave his word that free elections would be put in place, and it was agreed that Poland would receive territorial compensation from Germany, while the Soviets would be allowed to keep the Polish territory they'd snatched earlier on in the war. President Roosevelt's main aim at the conference was to ask for Russian help with the war the Americans were fighting with Japan in the Pacific. The now ailing American president wanted to invade Japan, but needed greater support, and Stalin agreed to enter into this battle within 90 days of defeating Germany, although Churchill was far from comfortable at the prospect. Another major area of discussion was the plans for German occupation zones once the war was over. It was agreed that control of Germany was to be split 3 ways between the Americans, Great Britain and Russia. Berlin was also to be split into 3, even though the German capital fell in the Russian zone. As the talking continued, it was by this point evident that an Allied victory was inevitable. German communications were breaking down, and their supplies were insufficient for them to be able to defend themselves against the Red Army and the Western Allies advancing across the Rhine. With the Allies closing in, Hitler was advised by his commanders to flee to his mountain retreat, the Berghof at Berchtesgaden in Bavaria. But instead, he resolutely refused to run for the hills, preferring to seek refuge in an underground bunker at the heart of Berlin. It's been suggested that Hitler still believed his 1,000-year Reich could be saved. And when Joseph Goebbels, his loyal Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, informed him of the death of President Roosevelt, he felt he was given a glimmer of hope. Victory in Europe was so close, and yet for the American president so far, because on the 12th of April 1945, Roosevelt suffered a brain hemorrhage and died at the age of 63. The grand funeral procession that took place in Washington before Roosevelt was finally laid to rest was a mark of respect to a man who'd fought so hard for world peace. During this crucial and significant time, Roosevelt's vice president, Harry S. Truman, was appointed the 33rd American president. Without a doubt, he had a very tough act to follow. Nevertheless, Truman was far more suspicious of Stalin than Roosevelt had been, and Hitler believed that without the elder statesman's voice of reason, conflict between the Allies might just give the Germans a fighting chance. But the Allies had come too far to falter now, but in these final days of the war in Europe, their actions were on occasion controversial. From the 13th of February to the 15th, Allied bombers targeted the German city of Dresden with devastating consequences. The British Royal Air Force and the United States Air Force flew 4 separate raids and dropped nearly 4,000 tons of explosives, destroying over 13 square miles of the city. The controversy stemmed from the fact that many saw Dresden as a cultural landmark with no military significance, and when the bombings were carried out, the attacks were indiscriminate and in no way proportional to any possible military gain. Inflicting an estimated death toll in the region of 40,000, the bombing of Dresden has gone down in history as one of the worst examples of civilian suffering and was actually considered by some to be a war crime. The German propaganda machine certainly took full advantage of the situation, producing horrific posters declaring Dresden, massacre of refugees. This was a time when Hitler knew keeping his people motivated was virtually impossible, and as German cities crumbled, even the military became aware that defeat was now staring them in the face. Even so, the tenacity and determination of many German soldiers to fight to the last man meant that the Allied casualties continued to rise. The number of American soldiers killed in April of 1944 were lost again in 1945, even though the German position was considerably stronger in the previous year. Literally, the Nazis had nothing to lose. Many faced trial as war criminals, and the retribution likely to be visited upon them by the advancing Russians made the prospect of death in battle the lesser of all evils. As the Allies marched towards Berlin from all directions, the true horrors of Hitler's regime, even in his own country, were daily revealed, and the concentration camps that had been such a crucial part of the Nazi operation to maintain control in Germany were finally liberated. In the first instance, intended to hold Hitler's political opponents from the early 1930s onwards, the Nazis soon expanded their use of concentration camps throughout the territories they occupied across Europe. When the Germans had stormed into Poland in 1939, millions of Jews were targeted and many were sent to the newly built camps. This was all part of Hitler's master plan to eliminate all those he considered undesirable, as he sought to create a race of purebred Aryans. But it wasn't just the Jews singled out for such barbaric treatment. Communists, gypsies, homosexuals, people with disabilities, those of ethnic origin, and even Freemasons were sent to concentration camps, and one of the most poignant stories of this period of liberation is that of the American arrival at the Buchenwald camp. Ironically, as the Allies edged ever closer to victory, the dangers for the inmates of the concentration camps increased dramatically as the desperate Germans attempted to eliminate as many as they could. At Buchenwald on the 8th of April, the Germans started to evacuate their prisoners, but a Polish POW who'd built a secret radio sent out an SOS message to the Allies. It was picked up by the Americans, who replied that they were on their way. So, heartened, the remaining inmates stormed the camp, killed the guards, and waited to greet their liberators as heroes when they arrived on the 11th of April. Nevertheless, the atrocities witnessed by the American troops at Buchenwald was sickening, just as they were at all the other concentration camps, including Belsen and Dachau, that the Allies reached. News of the Buchenwald was quickly relayed to Eisenhower, and he immediately arranged, along with Generals Omar Bradley and George S. Patton, to visit the scene of these appalling crimes against humanity. They arrived on the 12th of April, and after seeing what had happened for himself, he ordered every American soldier in the area to observe the devastation, to remind them exactly what they were fighting for. Eisenhower described the camps as beyond the American mind to comprehend, and because the atrocities were virtually indescribable, to prevent any later confusion and accusations of propaganda, he made sure that all media and military camera units available made a photographic record of the tragic evidence. The writing was now on the wall. The Allies were into their final push, and Hitler's mental state began to deteriorate as, in desperation, he demanded that the Germans destroy their homeland before the invading forces could. The people of Germany had for so long been forced to do Hitler's bidding, but this was one command that even his top generals were not prepared to implement, which was a great relief to the civilian population, and for the Führer, all he could do was watch his power base slip away from him. The battle for Berlin was now on, and the Russians, who'd been preparing for this moment since January 1945, when they began their journey from Warsaw in Poland, made ready to finish the war that Hitler had started. As April progressed, the Soviets put what they called the Berlin Strategic Offensive Operation into action. The Russians were in an extremely powerful position, with over 3 million men, 6,250 tanks, and 7,500 planes. In complete contrast, the Nazi armed forces had hardly anything left to defend themselves with. But as Eisenhower had suspected, they were not going to go down without a fight. The Russian Red Army had 3 main divisions in place. 2 were attacking from the east and 1 from the north. Stalin gave his men 2 weeks to finish the job, and they relished the opportunity to take their revenge for what their nation had suffered at Hitler's hands. Nevertheless, with newly appointed commanders at the ready, the Germans did all they could to prepare for the imminent battle. General Gotthard Heinrici developed tactics for protecting Berlin, concentrating on defending with his top divisions in order to have the best chance, as the Germans were outnumbered 3-1 by the Russians. Suspecting that the Red Army would most likely attack across the River Oder, he had 3 encampments built alongside its marshy floodplains. Reaching as far as the outskirts of Berlin, the area was made ready with trenches and bunkers to make things as difficult as possible for the enemy. Fortunately for the Germans, as expected, the Red Army's initial phase of attack was across the River Oder, and the ensuing battle that commenced on the 16th of April 1945, lasting 4 days, ironically, didn't go well for the Russians. Anticipating the attack, Heinrici withdrew all his soldiers from the first line of trenches, which meant the Soviets, who were struggling with the marshy terrain, were unable to surprise the defending Germans. However, the determined Russians soon started to make some headway, advancing some 6 kilometers, but the casualties were high, and the German lines still remained intact. In fact, it wasn't until the Russians attacked from the south that the German defences began to give way. By the 19th of April, the Red Army had made the breakthrough that they so desperately needed, and all that lay between the Russians and Berlin were broken fortifications and a desperate nation on the brink of defeat. The next stage in the Soviets' offensive was the encirclement of Berlin, and by the 20th of April, which was Hitler's birthday, the Russians began to collect in a strong circling position that drove the Führer into a nervous rage. Desperately, he clutched at straws, moving small divisions from other areas into this one-sided battle to be crushed by the mighty Red Army. For days, the encirclement got tighter and tighter, and by the 25th of April, there was nothing that the German army could do beyond delaying the inevitable. In a desperate attempt to continue to defend his city, Hitler called upon the young boys of the Hitler Youth and the elderly men of the Volkssturm, the civilian People's Army, along with members of the police force, to take up arms. But the number only came to a mere 45,000, which could do little against the millions of Russian troops now overrunning Berlin. The Soviets moved into the city on the 29th of April. But before the operation could be completed, the Russians needed the roads and bridges of Berlin to be repaired, so that the artillery supplies could be delivered. And once done, even Hitler had to face facts. His dream of a 1,000-year Reich now lay in ruins, as did Berlin, and with defeat looming larger by the hour, there was only one option the Führer was prepared to consider. As the Russians secured Berlin, shortly after making his final will and testament, Hitler married his long-term mistress, Eva Braun. His affair with Eva had been kept a secret, as Hitler felt it would upset his adoring female followers. But in these final hours, the couple became man and wife. The very next day, the 30th of April, the Soviets marched into the Reichstag, the Nazi seat of government. But still, patriotic German soldiers fought on, resulting in bitter skirmishes from room to room in the historic building. But it was to no avail, and before long the Soviets took control. Knowing his fate, Hitler shared a final meal with his two favourite secretaries before retiring to his private room with his bride, where they both committed suicide. The war in Europe was in effect over. Hitler was dead and had left the Reich presidency to Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz and the position of Reich Chancellor to the ever-loyal Joseph Goebbels. Dönitz had made up his mind to seek a surrender to the Western Allies in an attempt to prevent the Russians dominating post-war Germany. But Goebbels knew that whatever the outcome, his position would be untenable. As many German officers made their escape from Hitler's bunker, Goebbels summed up his thoughts with alarming clarity. He said, "For us, everything is lost now, and the only way left for us is the one which Hitler chose. I shall follow his example." But his actions would have tragic consequences for his family. On the evening of the 1st of May, after taking the lives of their 6 children, Goebbels and his wife Magda committed suicide. This left Dönitz the sole representative of the crumbling German Reich, and despite trying to surrender only to the Americans and the British, the man charged with accepting the surrender, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, made it very clear that only a surrender of all German forces in Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark was acceptable. So it was that on May the 4th, 1945, in a military tent on the Lüneburg Heath, 3 generals and 2 admirals sat awkwardly as Montgomery, in characteristic style, made the most of the historic occasion, taking at least half an hour to dress. He slowly strolled over to the tent and whispered to a reporter, "This is a very big moment." It most certainly was, and with an air of pride, Montgomery read aloud the terms of the surrender.
That is the text of the instrument surrender, and the German delegation.
The surrender would take effect from 8 a.m. on the 5th of May 1945. And even though there were still pockets of fighting, while the RAF were continuing to carry out attacks on the German U-boats, the war in Europe was at last over, and it was time to look to the future. The main instrument of surrender was signed 2 days later, on the 7th of May, at Rheims in France. This unconditional surrender of all German armed forces took effect at 23:01 hours Central European Time on the 8th of May 1945. After signing, General Alfred Jodl of the German High Command asked that the Allies treat his fellow countrymen with respect. But after the way the Nazis had conducted the war in Europe, promoting reconciliation between the nations, particularly those who'd suffered years of German occupation, was never going to be an easy task.